Hello, I'm Mark Esper, former United States Secretary of Defense and the inaugural John S. McCain Distinguished Fellow at the McCain Institute for International Leadership here in Washington, D.C. Today, I'm honored to welcome a longtime friend of the United States, the current President of the Republic of Colombia, His Excellency, the President Duque Marquez. As we know, Colombia is the United States' most important ally in Latin America. In fact, next year will mark the 200th anniversary of relations between Colombia and the U.S., two of the oldest democracies in the Western Hemisphere. Trade between our two countries is quite robust after the signing of a free trade agreement between Bogota and Washington in 2012. Indeed, the United States is Colombia's largest trading partner. Moreover, Colombia joined the OECD, the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, last year and has been a NATO partner country, the alliance's first from Latin America since 2017. Lastly, President Biden and President Duque talked recently, and Secretary Blinken chose Colombia as his first South American trip, reaffirming the historic important relationship between our two nations. I guess I should add that my first visit to Colombia was in the early 2000s as part of a congressional delegation led by Senator John McCain, who always placed great importance in our nation's bilateral relationship. With that background as prologue, we will aim today to discuss a number of topics, from other countries in the region such as Venezuela and Nicaragua to outsiders like China, Russia, and Iran. We will also discuss the peace accord between the Colombian government and the FARC, counter-narcotics efforts between our two countries, and what the people of Colombia and the region should expect going forward. We have the perfect guest today to help inform, enlighten, and guide us on these matters. President Duque has served in a variety of high-level political roles throughout his illustrious career. Prior to becoming president of Colombia, President Duque was an elected senator from 2014 to 2017. He also served as one of Colombia's representatives at the Inter-American Development Bank, appointed by President Santos from 2001 to 2013. As I mentioned, President Duque is also a known champion of the historic U.S.-Colombia partnership, so it is my honor to welcome him here today. President Duque, welcome.
Thank you so much, Mr. Secretary. It is a great honor for me to participate in this very important event. And I also keep on remembering the legacy of this great American political leader, John McCain. I had the privilege of meeting him, and I feel that you're also contributing to preserve his legacy. So, Mr. Secretary, thank you so much for this invitation. And as you know, we will always want to be working in partnership with the McCain Institute. So thank you for having me.
Well, thank you very much for that, Mr. President. We appreciate it. With that, I would like to start by asking you why you think Colombia and the United States have enjoyed close relations for nearly 2 centuries, and what can we learn from that long relationship in order to continue to strengthen it going forward?
Well, first of all, I want to highlight that next year we'll be celebrating 200 years of bilateral relationships. It was during President Monroe's term where our ambassador, Manuel Trujillo y Torres, not only persuaded him, but also the Secretary of State, John Quincy Adams, to recognize the Republic of Colombia. And actually, Colombia was the first former Spanish colony to be recognized as a republic by the United States. So it has been 200 years where we have shared values, principles, and I should say the defense of democracy, the pursuit of happiness that every citizen has. But I also believe something that is a cornerstone of our democracy, which is the private initiative. And I should also highlight that in the last 20 years, something that has driven the relationship between the Colombia and the United States is that in Washington, the support has been bipartisan and bicameral. So beyond the political cycles that we face in Colombia or that the United States faces, the relationship is so strong that year over year has become stronger. And I should highlight the importance of Plan Colombia in the early 2000s during the Clinton administration, the free trade agreement that was pushed by President George W. Bush, also the cooperation that we got from the Obama administration, and also the strong support that we got from the Trump administration, not only to deal with the fight against narco trafficking, but also to protect 1.8 million migrants that have come to our country from Venezuela. So I think this bipartisan, bicameral relationship has also been strengthened by President Biden. President Biden has given very strong messages to the Colombian people. President Biden and his team are looking for Colombia to see the epicenter of the Build Back Better World initiative in the Americas. We're also working together on climate action with former Secretary John Kerry. And we're also working with the support of USAID to make important transformation in rural areas that have been historically affected by poverty or by violence. So in a nutshell, I think the most important thing that we have achieved is that this relationship is based on principles, values, and we have all governments in the United States and Colombia worked closely with the purpose of building a stronger alliance year over year.
Well, Mr. President, thank you for that rich recitation of our nation's histories. It's quite extraordinary and vibrant. And I also appreciate you updating us on some of the topics that you presently are working on with President Biden and his administration. And we'll talk about a couple of those. I was glad to hear you mention, though, that Colombia has a long-standing tradition of defending democracy in the region. And I want to pull the thread on that first point, because Colombia does have a very vibrant democracy. What is your assessment, though, of the state of democracy throughout the region? Is it in decline?
I should say something, Mr. Secretary. I think we have to be clear that we can't take democracy for granted. Democracy is very important. We have to preserve it every day, every moment. But there are threats to democracies. I think demagoguery, populism, extremism are making a lot of damage. We saw the deterioration in Venezuela that during the Chavez regime kept being a democracy, but it turned into a dictocracy and later on into a dictatorship. And today is the most brutal dictatorship we have seen in the whole hemisphere. Now we're seeing the same pattern evolving in Nicaragua. And we see other places where their limits and the checks and balances are being threatened day over day. So I think we have to preserve democracy. Democracy is crucial for development. It is the essence of this hemispheric vision of development. So I think we all have to be strong enough to denounce when we see threats to democracy. And that's why I presented before the Inter-American Human Rights Commission what it's called a consultatory opinion, saying that those permanent re-elections without limits in many countries can simply become into dictocracies and dictatorships. So I'm glad that the Inter-American Commission on Human Rights said that clearly that is a threat to democracy. I'm also worried when I see that there are attacks on free press or where there are attacks against independent powers. So I think we can take it for granted. But what we're doing here in Colombia is that despite all the circumstances that we have always fought, violence, narco trafficking, and recently the effects of the COVID-19 pandemic, we have shown that within the separation of powers, we still have coordination and we can all act together, respecting our roles, our responsibilities, and defending the separation of powers to protect our nation. So we work with Congress, we work with the judiciary, and I think the articulated response to the COVID-19 crisis has allowed us to this year grow almost above 8.5% and reaching the highest economic growth of this century. And that's just a demonstration that we have done it in democracy, for democracy, and we have done it to empower the people to have the liberty to make their decisions.
Well, thank you, Mr. President. Those are all very important points about democracy, and I couldn't agree more. History is not linear, and governments can backslide. And so we must continue to protect and defend and advance democracy. And to that point, the Biden administration next week, as you know, is holding a virtual democracy summit. Colombia is one of the many countries that has been invited to participate. What will be the main message you will deliver at the summit?
I think, Mr. Secretary, something that we have to value is that the U.S. Constitution of 1789 was the inspiration of many constitutions that we saw, that we have read, that we have studied in Latin America. Colombia is celebrating 200 years of our first constitution, the Constitution of Cucuta. That constitution had the presidential power, the separation of powers, democracy, the concept of property, security, equality, and liberty. And it also had very strong sentiments that were clearly expressed, so that within the separation of powers, the military has to be always defender of the Constitution, defender of the legal system, but not a tool to be manipulated by who governs the country. All those elements that connect democracy from the United States to the rest of the hemisphere, it's because I think we have all matured our democracies in such a way that we definitely have to make a reflection on how to make them strong and how to fight the crisis and the threats that are putting democracy in jeopardy in other places of the region. So in fact, I believe this summit is going to be very important because we clearly see the threats that we have in Venezuela. We're seeing the threats now in Nicaragua. And we have seen other authoritarian regimes in the region that have also been promoting activities, crises, and also trying to generate despair through the pressure of massive social media manipulation. All these elements have to be discussed. And I think we have to connect democracy with the freedom of the people to select, to choose, but also we have to defend the private sector initiative. The attacks on the private sector, sometimes the stubborn, demagogic positions of some of the extremist leaders who are attacking X, Y, or Z sector just because they dislike those sectors, affecting the certainty that must be always aligned with the economic liberty, is something that we should debate that. So I see the summit as a very important instrument of discussion. And as I have said it many times, I think it's also the opportunity to build a 21st century sort of alliance for progress, where I think the Build Back Better World initiative, the B3W, can be a way to be promoted for friendshoring, nearshoring, and allow many of the partners of the United States in the Latin American region to re-emphasize our embrace of democracy as our cornerstone and as our guide, but linking that democracy with the necessary elements to be implemented to promote private sector initiative. So I'm very glad that President Biden has made this calling. And yes, we will be there with enthusiasm.
That's great to hear, Mr. President. We're all hopeful that it'll be a very productive summit and everybody looks forward to its outcome. You know, in your remarks, you mentioned a couple of countries in the region. I want to focus briefly on Venezuela and Cuba. Both are authoritarian states that have done great harm to their peoples and their countries over many years. Colombia, on the other hand, has been a stalwart defender of liberal democracy, as we discussed, and has called out Havana's and Caracas's malign behavior, while also welcoming 1.7 Venezuelan refugees, a great humanitarian gesture. What can we learn from these problem states, and what should we collectively do to bring freedom and democracy to the peoples of Venezuela and Cuba and Nicaragua?
Mr. Secretary, I might sound simplistic in what I'm going to say, but it's the freedom to choose. You can't have a modern society, you can't have a free society if you don't allow people to choose. It is true that under international law, each country can determine what's the right way to govern. But it happens that in this hemisphere, in September 11, 2001, when we were facing the attacks on the United States, we also saw that in Lima, the Inter-American Democratic Charter was approved. And that democratic charter has become a light and an inspiration for all of us to strongly defend democracy. You can't see progress in this region if you're limiting the private initiative, if you're not allowing independent powers to prevail, if you're not protecting free press, if you're not defending the freedom of speech. So I think that this is one of the strongest elements of Colombia's DNA, is that we have one of the oldest and more vibrant democracies in the hemisphere, that we have been able to keep on building on the shoulders of those who came before us, under the premise that there are long-term state policies. And I think we have been able also to see the maturity of our judicial system, our legislative power, and the executive power, generation by generation. And that even though sometimes we had re-elections, other times we just have 4-year periods like mine, I think we were all able to concentrate and work on addressing the needs of all Colombians. So the way that Colombia has progressed, and today that is one of the economies that is growing faster around the world, that is reducing unemployment, that is doing well, massive vaccination, that is also becoming the Silicon Valley of Latin America, that has also embraced the biggest social safety net expenditure in history. We've done this through democracy. So I think that's why our example, it's so important as a reference model, especially for those societies where people are claiming to recover liberty. And yes, we have not only been protecting 1.7 or 1.8 million migrants in our territory, but we have also raised our voice to denounce the dictatorship of Nicolas Maduro, because that's being in the right side of history. And that's acting with our moral duty of not leaving any country behind where you see opprobrious attempts against the people. So that's why Colombia defends the democratic charter, but it is also aligned with the values that the United States has also embraced, not to allow this region to be affected by dictatorships.
Yeah, thank you for that. I'd like to pivot now to other countries from outside the hemisphere who are also active in Latin America. And so how has the involvement of China, Russia, and Iran impacted the situations in places like Cuba, Venezuela, and Nicaragua?
I think, Mr. Secretary, many of the things that you have seen in international analysis can clearly demonstrate that obviously in some places there are interventions. In some places there has been maybe the attempts of citizens of those countries to try to affect the way democracy happens. But all this, for some are speculation, for some others there's evidence. But I think the important thing to recognize is that in the case of Colombia, Colombia has diplomatic relationship with the three countries. Colombia has diplomatic relationships with Russia, diplomatic relationships with Iran, diplomatic relationships also with China. And we have kept our friendly attitude towards those countries. But we have also been clear that where we have differences, we're able to expose our differences with clarity and with the strong arguments. So in the case of Iran, Colombia is now part of the General Council of the International Atomic Energy Agency. And yes, we're worried, and we have said in the council that we don't want to see more uranium enrichment in Iran, and that Iran has to allow the inspections from the IAEA. Otherwise, it's putting the world in danger. In the case of Russia, we have had very long-term diplomatic relationships. But when we have seen that there is personnel from the diplomatic community that is not behaving in accordance to the Vienna Convention, we have acted. And we have been able to deal with difficult circumstances, but we have done it with arguments. And in the case of China, I should say that we have a very important and friendly relationship. China has been active in Colombia, not in the last 2 years or 5 years or 10 years. We have a diplomatic relationship that has been in place for more than 40 years. And we have seen Chinese companies investing in Colombia. We have Colombian companies that are investing in China. We want to close our trade deficit. We want to identify opportunities because it's one of the largest markets in the world. So I think we have been able to build with them a very important relationship that we value. But I think if we ever identify big differences, we will also raise our voice. So that's part of the way Colombia has handled international relationships. Friendly, respectful, but always firm on the things and the values that we want to defend, not only in the region, but around the world.
Well, thank you. I was going to ask you how does Colombia deal with countries such as Russia, Iran, and China, all three of which are authoritarian states. And China, as we all know, is promoting the notion that their form of government is better than democracies and democratic governments. And it's one thing that I know that our country is dealing with. President Biden has spoken out about, and I think it will remain a challenge for us going forward. That said, I mentioned up front that the United States is Colombia's largest trading partner, but China is Colombia's second largest trading partner. And moreover, Latin America as a whole does more trade with China than they do with the United States. How is it that Beijing has developed such a robust economic presence in Latin America?
Well, I think, Mr. Secretary, it's always good to have things in a historical context, because I've been asked many times about why do we have such a long-term relationship. And I think it's not just Colombia. I think the whole hemisphere starting having strong diplomatic relationships with China in the 1970s. So I remember, and we all have read the books, when President Nixon visited Chairman Mao, and how President Nixon also made a very important diplomatic change in the way the United States handles in international relationships, recognizing the People's Republic of China as a representation of China in the Security Council in the United Nations. And obviously that started having a lot of impact in the way the international system works. And then in the last 40 years, you see that China has become also one of the United States' top 2 or top 3 trading partners. Also, China is maybe the number 1 U.S. debt holder around the world. And the United States has been trying to close the trade deficit year over year. So I think based on that example, also many other countries in Latin America have also built strong diplomatic relationships. And yes, China is a very important economic power. And China has the capacity to export many of goods and services around the world. And what we're trying to do in countries like ours is also to work to close those trade deficits, but also be able to open the markets for us to send our exports, but also to diversify our exports. So we're pleased to have the United States as our number 1 trading partner, but also the United States is our number 1 ally in the hemisphere. And in the case of China, yes, we have increased our exports. We still have to do a lot to close the trade deficit. But we're also glad that in some projects, we have seen Chinese investment coming to the country. And I think they have the duty of perform well, because they have to respond to the contracts that they have been granted after a very objective selection of who the bidders are and how they participate and who wins the projects. So I just see this in a way in which we try to have diplomatic and trade relationships around the world. But still, we have the clear conviction that with the United States of America, we are more than just trading partners, commercial partners. We are really allies that share vision, principles, and values. And one of those values is definitely democracy.
Mr. President, do you have any thoughts on how the United States can better compete with China in Latin America in order to ensure that we remain the clear partner of choice for the region's democracies?
Well, that's a good question, Mr. Secretary, because sometimes I get asked by business media why, for example, Chinese corporations are winning so much infrastructure projects. And I definitely say, because, they're present and they bid. And we definitely want to see more American companies coming to Latin America and participate in infrastructure technology biddings. Obviously, I think that's something that must happen. But I also believe that the policy that President Biden has launched, the B3W, is very important. This is strong. And I think also the idea of nearshoring that came from the previous administration that is now being conceived under B3W as friendshoring is also a bipartisan, bicameral way to say, this is the moment for the United States to rethink that they can build with Latin America a new alliance for progress for the 21st century. So the way I see B3W is an opportunity to bring more U.S. investment in infrastructure, but also to allow companies in Latin America to engage in aggregated value chains and be able to export to the United States and generate jobs and opportunities. And I also believe that the success of B3W can also be a way to deter and minimize migration crises in the southern border of the United States, because more opportunities will be distributed along the region. So I think it's a win-win. And I also value that many companies from the United States have come to Colombia, for example, and make a strong investments, generate a lot of jobs. And we also feel very proud that Colombia has made in the last few years the largest Colombian investment in another country, with the investment that Ecopetrol has done on the Permian Basin in Texas in association with Occidental Petroleum. So I think there is a very nice story to tell. And as I say, Mr. Secretary, I think we have to also do more pitching and bring more investors. But I think the best way the U.S. capitalize the relationship that it has with Latin America is to be able to bring more companies to participate in strategic project biddings. And I think that could be a very substantial contribution.
And of course, free trade agreements like the one signed between the United States and Colombia less than 10 years ago has a dramatic impact on our economic relationship, which then bleeds over, of course, into our other relationships and reinforces our shared values and interests.
And I should say, yeah, I think that's a great point, because the way I see trade in international relationships is because I think it's a constructivist vision. So when you look at many of the theorists of international relationships in the United States, even from the times of Dean Acheson or the wise man, as they were called in this great book by Walter Isaacson, they all conceived that trade was a way to prevent conflict. And the important thing is that the United States has a positive trading balance with Colombia. So we don't necessarily compete in all the areas of products, but when there is the possibility for a Colombian product to access the United States market, the amount of opportunities it generates, it's really fascinating. So in my administration, we have been able to expand the exports of avocado, but we also got the accession of green pepper 2 years ago. And last week, we got the accession of Colombian mangoes. So having that FDA standard, being able to get into the U.S. market, represents that in Colombia, there are going to be a lot of peasants in rural areas that will get a job and will get income derived of the accession of those products. And imagine if we can do that also with cocoa, with palm oil, with products that are also drivers of defeating the illegal economies in certain parts of the country, so that they can really disincentivize people to be in the illegal economy and prefer the legal crops. That also generates a lot of development. So I should mention the free trade agreement, in my opinion, has been the most important policy after Plan Colombia in terms of generating the conditions for sustainable and predictable trade and investment relationship between Colombia and the United States.
That's great to hear. Thank you for that. Mr. President, I'm going to change gears on you real quick and say that today marks, of course, the 5-year anniversary of the Colombian congressional ratification of the peace deal between the prior government and the FARC. The United States also removed the FARC from its official list of terrorist organizations today. And the UN Secretary General was in Colombia last week to commemorate the 5-year anniversary of the peace deal. Let me start by asking you what this all means to you, not just as president of Colombia, but as a Colombian who lived through this conflict for many years.
Well, as you know, Mr. Secretary, when we had the plebiscite, I cheered for the no, But it wasn't because I was against peace. It's because I really thought that many things could have been improved and could have prevented circumstances that we have had to fight over years. But I think the important thing to say is that once I came to office, we launched our first policy, and it was the Peace with Legality Policy. So in the last 3 years and 4 months, we have been able to create 14 out of the 16 regional focus development plans that are accelerating investments in regions that have been badly hit by violence and poverty. We have also supported people that are in the process of reincorporation to legality. We have also supported with funding the transitional justice, but we have also said respectfully that we expect the transitional justice to have punishments and that it really protects the values of truth, reparation, non-repetition, and obviously justice, objective justice. We have expanded the bill to protect the victims. We have made the regulations so that there are members in Congress that clearly represent the victims that have been affected by terrorist groups throughout our history. So I think all those are elements that we have accelerated, and that's why the Secretary General and many others from the international community have valued that we have worked in Colombia to clearly make a difference in the way we build peace. Obviously, this process will take also 2 more administrations, if not 3, in the implementation. But I think we have the possibility to put our own seal to the kind of policies in which we want to make an emphasis. And I think we got a lot of applauses because of the things that we have achieved. And especially Secretary Guterres made a very clear distinction on other peace processes around the world. And he said, what you're doing in Colombia is really remarkable, and it should be a reference model for the rest of the world. Now, I also believe that the U.S. decision that was made on taking FARC out of the list, I think it should be highlighted that the U.S. is including the FARC dissidencies and the New Marquetalia, and the members of those organizations keep them on in the terrorist list. Now, former members of FARC who are now in a party who have left arms that have processes in the United States, the processes will continue. There's no going back on that. And I think that's important. And I think the United States has also said clearly that they're not going to grant visas to those people that have pendant trials in U.S. courts. So I think making that distinction really makes us understand that this is more a protocolary decision, even though I think maybe it could have stayed a little bit longer to see the real sanctions that will be derived from the transitional justice. But I think we have to be objective. And at this point in time, what really matters is that we will continue fighting the dissidencies with the support of the United States, and that we will keep on requesting respectfully to the transitional justice that we really see truth, reparation, justice, and non-repetition.
Mr. President, you made a very good point that the peace deal could serve as a model for other conflicts around the world, and I think you and I could quickly tick off a half dozen out there. So, what are the 1 or 2 things that you would just pull out of this experience of the peace deal that you think, as other countries, other governments around the world look at their internal situation that are facing conflict, should consider that was a lesson from the peace deal?
Mr. Secretary, more than the deal itself, I want to refer at those things of the policy that we have implemented that we call the peace with legality, that in my opinion should be a reference model. The first thing is that for people that are in the process of reincorporation, we have been able to grant them the access to Social Security. We have been able to maintain them without the temptation of going back to illegal activities, more than 95%. But I think we have created a policy framework to take public and private investment to poor rural areas that were badly affected by violence. The 16 regional focus development plans, out of which 14 were conceived in my administration, are mobilizing more than $2,000 million to work on water and storage, electrification, clean cooking, and also peasants entrepreneurship, agglomerations of peasants to have the possibility to sell their crops to the bigger distribution lines around the country, working on a national cadastre, being able to grant almost 50,000 land titles by the end of this year, which will make a historical number, because it will be the government, we will be the government that will be giving more land titles to people in Colombia. So all these things I consider are successful, but I also, and I should say this, I think we have made a clear differentiation. People who have invested in reincorporation and in legality, we support them, we accompany them so that they can have that path to legality. But we have also been very clear that there's zero tolerance with terrorist groups and the FARC dissidencies and ELN. So we have not only made the most important military or police decisions, we have made big hits on those criminals, including the capture of Otoniel, including the killing of Rodrigo Cadete, and also other kingpins from FARC, but also being able to be the government that has made the largest interdiction of drugs, surpassing 500 tons of cocaine last year, and also getting close to 600 tons this year. And we have been able to destroy thousands of cocaine production laboratories. So we invest in the areas that have been affected by violence. We work with the people in the transition to reincorporation, but we are also being tough and will be tougher on all the criminal structures that are from the FARC dissidents around the world, around the country.
Mr. President, I'm going to switch topics again on you. And you just talked a little bit about this, and that is counter narcotics. You mentioned Colombia's successes. In 2020, for example, your government manually eradicated 130,000 hectares of coca, the highest figure in the last decade. That's an area 20 times the size of Manhattan, nearly 10 times more than what was eradicated in 2015. And then just last week, Colombia's armed forces made their largest drug bust of the year, seizing 10 tons of cocaine from the ELN valued at $300 million. At the same time, reports indicate that Colombia produces more cocaine now than in the early 1990s. And at the same time, of course, the United States generates the highest demand for these dangerous and illegal drugs. In your recent high-level dialogue last month with Secretary of State Blinken, a holistic approach toward this problem was mentioned. What does that approach look like? Can you give us some insights?
Well, Mr. Secretary, I also want to thank you, because when you were in office, you gave us a very strong support to fight narco trafficking. And as you well know, when I assumed office, we had more than 200,000 hectares of coca in the country. I embraced the decisions to fight this in a holistic approach, and we have been able to reduce. But first of all, we stopped the exponential growth, and then we had a reduction. But obviously, it hasn't been easy, and also because we have been attending the pandemic. Nevertheless, we have been able to have historical levels of interdiction, surpassing 500 tons of cocaine. We have also reached historical numbers in the way we have been dismantling laboratories. We have also reached very important record highs in manual eradication. So I value those achievements because they have been conceived, and that's also the product of the hard work of soldiers and policemen around the country. Also people from the Navy and the Air Force, they all working together to protect not only our citizens, but also the citizens of the United States, because the seizures that Colombia produces every year in terms of legal drugs is the equivalent of 45% of all the interdictions done in the Western Hemisphere. So that demonstrates how Colombia is doing. But I think, and I value the leadership of Secretary Blinken, because definitely this is a two-way situation. So there has to be a lot of cooperation. Last year, because the patterns of life were changed by the pandemic, the consumption of drugs around the world skyrocketed. It skyrocketed in the United States, it skyrocketed in Brazil, it skyrocketed in Colombia, skyrocketed in Europe. So my question is, yes, there has to be a co-responsibility. We can do all we can in terms to attack the supply. But the problem is, Mr. Secretary, that there is being now a rising demand. So we need to see more campaigns, not only in the United States, but in Europe and other places around the world, to make the people conscious that they should say no to drugs. Maybe as Nancy Reagan said at a certain moment in time, that campaign was very important, and it was launched and driven by a first lady of the United States. But I think today we have to make people understand that people that consume cocaine, what is it that they are really consuming? So the first thing, when you consume cocaine, you're sponsoring an ecocide, because in order to plant 1 hectare of coca, 2 hectares of tropical jungle are deforested. There are also a lot of chemicals that are thrown in the jungles, affecting diverse ecosystems. And people don't really know that to produce 1 gram of cocaine, there are almost 2 gallons of gasoline has been consumed. So in terms of emissions and in terms of the environmental impact that the production of cocaine generates, it's really a mess. So it's important also in that campaign to generate acknowledgement of this, also to debrand cocaine. And by debranding is to show the people that are consuming that with every gram they consume, they are sponsoring terrorist groups that kills children, women, attacks the environment, attacks infrastructure, and generates corruption. So it is very important for us to keep on doing as much as we can to control the supply. But I think we have to see also as well strong commitments around the world so that we can really make a substantial reduction on the consumption rates that skyrocketed in 2020.
You're giving us all great education on this scourge, this illicit trade that really destroys people and corrodes communities. And it's tragic. And as I mentioned earlier, my first trip to Colombia with Senator McCain in the early 2000s, we went down to, I think, Punta Mayo and got a great education on what was happening at the time. And this was at the height of Plan Colombia, if I recall properly, but tremendous effort between our 2 countries. And I appreciate you mentioning the initiative in the last administration that the Department of Defense led. It was very important for us to substantially increase our counter-narcotics efforts through air interdiction, sea interdiction, and other ways by which we were working with partners such as Colombia to do that. And by the way, I would be remiss if I didn't mention it was just prior to that initiative launching in February 2020 that I hosted your former Minister of Defense, the late Carlos Holmes Trujillo,
for we miss him.
Pentagon, and we discussed everything from this issue to joint training and exercises between our 2 militaries. And I was very sorry to learn of his passing. He was a very good counterpart, and I really enjoyed getting to know him. So
we miss him. We miss him a lot. We lost him because of COVID. He was a great statesman, and he was a very close friend of mine, and also one of the most important leaders in policy making in my administration. So we always praise his memory, and we know that from heaven he's still supporting us, giving us strong support to make strong achievements. And actually last year, we reached the lowest homicide rate in 46 years. And we did that together with Carlos.
Well, thank you. He was a wonderful man. So we miss him as well. A couple of final questions, and you've been tremendous with your time. And I want to pivot quickly to Nicaragua as that country once again descends into dictatorship. What lessons should we draw from this development? And is there a need right now to jumpstart another multinational process like we had in the 1980s, beginning with the Contador Group, to bring democracy to Central America, to strengthen the democracies of Central America?
I should say this in a simplistic way, but Ortega is Maduro's copycat. So he just want to copy paste the same thing. It's a democracy, a dictocracy, then a dictatorship, then a brutal dictatorship. So that's where it is today. And should we do more things around the region to protect democracy? I say yes. And I think next week's event that is going to be hosted and led by President Biden, I think it's an important opportunity for us to say the things how they are. Because the worst thing that could happen is people to remain silent when things are happening. So a lot of people said when I was running for the presidency, hey, why are you so keen on denouncing and going to International Criminal Court against Maduro? And I just said, because, it's at the end, it's like if you're you're living in a condo building, and then your neighbor next door every single night is beating his wife and his children, and you hear the screams door to door, wall to wall, and you just don't say anything. And then in the morning, you get into the elevator and you pretend everything is fine. That's not the moral way to act. So we have been denouncing the brutality of the Maduro regime. I have been denouncing Maduro since I was a senator. I denounced him again when I became president. And I value that the International Criminal Court has opened a formal investigation against him and against his regime, because it's really absurd. He has become the Slobodan Milosevic of Latin America. So it is very important to make those announcements. Now, in the way they have managed the government in the last 20 years, I think that Ortega is becoming the copycat. He wants to do the same. I mean, he imprisoned many of his opposers and the leaders of free media without a single blink. So I think we all have to see this as a dangerous move, and we all have to be strong and stronger throughout our institutions that we have in the hemisphere, because we cannot allow these practices to start becoming same old, because at the end, they can only generate a damage to a whole system that has been built with a lot of hard work over the years. So I think we have to be very strong protecting our democracies and the democratic values that we have all embraced.
Well, thank you for that, Mr. President. And as we wrap up, I would like to get your final thoughts on the future of the U.S.-Colombia relationship. Where do we need to go? What do we need to do?
Mr. Secretary, I am very happy. I think the most important asset that we have is that this is a bipartisan, bicameral relationship. Mm-hmm. The second thing that I value is that I think every single year there are many things to make the relationship stronger. We only have good things to remember from all the presidents in the last 20 years. And I am very thankful with President Biden. He has sent millions of vaccines to Colombia. We're working together on climate change with Secretary Kerry and also with the administration for us to become a carbon neutral country by 2050, to reduce our emissions by 51% in 2030, to protect 30% of the Colombian land by 2022, to be able to accelerate the energy transition. So we're working close on that. And I value the B3W initiative because I think it's a very important umbrella to have nearshoring, friendshoring, and allow countries to become part of global value chains, generate jobs, and at the same time, prevent massive migration that are just trying to cross the border to multiply themselves by the exchange rate. So having this vision of infrastructure and green businesses and protecting democracy, I think that is something that we definitely want to keep on strengthening year over year. And I see that next year is going to be a milestone because it's going to be the 200 years celebration. And yes, we're going to feel very proud about what Manuel Trujillo y Torres did with President Monroe, with Secretary John Quincy Adams. We're going to feel very happy to recognize President Clinton, President Bush, President Obama, President Trump, President Biden, because they have all in the last 25 years contributed into what, in my opinion, is a very important, successful story. Remember that in 1999, there was a cover in Foreign Policy magazine about failed states. And even Colombia was not a failed state. It was very close. And today, Colombia is one of the economies that is growing faster, has a strong, vibrant democracy, is a member of the OECD, is a member of NATO, and it's expanding its products around the world. It has become a leader in creative industries, in energy transition. So all this has been achieved, while at the same time, we have reached the lowest homicide rates in almost 40 years and the lowest kidnapping rates since those crimes are starting to be counted in our country. So all this is a very important success story to tell. And this story is beyond politics. It's, as I say, bipartisan, bicameral in the United States, but it's also multi-partisan in the case of Colombia.
Mr. President, thank you once again for joining us in our discussion today. Your answers and comments were very thoughtful and insightful and strategic, just as we expected. I've certainly enjoyed it, and I know our audience will learn a lot from today's discussion as well. So thank you.
Thank you so much, Mr. Secretary. And I really look forward for you to visit Colombia again. And again, I want to express my gratitude. We always remember the way that you worked with us and the strong support that you gave us to fight narco trafficking, terrorism, and also to build a stronger military and police bodies in Colombia.
Well, thank you again, President Duque. And I also want to thank you, the audience, for tuning in to the fourth in a series of conversations I'm having with global leaders about the challenges and opportunities the United States, its allies, and its partners will have faced in the years to come. Lastly, please follow the McCain Institute on Instagram and Twitter for updates on future events. Thank you again.